So I got a lot of feedback on a video that I actually posted something months ago, and it kind of blew up. I wanted to talk about it because I got a lot of feedback from a lot of idiots. I made the video about the GR4. I have the GR3, I have the GR3X. I've been using both of them, and I was just speculating on what I thought the GR4 would go as because I broke it down. But it's funny because, as always, on the internet, the people who actually watch the video and comment on what I actually said, not so much. Not so much a thing. Because the biggest comment by far, because the biggest thing I said that the GR4 needed was full frame. I think that this would work well. I think that this would do well. I actually think it's something that Ricoh would consider doing for a myriad of reasons. But the biggest thing that I got in feedback was that would make the GR bigger, and therefore GR would never do that. The actual thing is it defeats the purpose of the GR. What is the essence of GR? So before I go any further, there's two things that I would like to say. The first is a full frame sensor, a 35 millimeter sensor, does not necessarily make the GR that much bigger. Marginally so. I understand that we're talking, grams and centimeters here. But I think generally speaking, they are about the same size as what you have now. And the reason why I'm taking that is the original GR is a film camera. The lens of the original GR film camera exists as a full frame lens. The back to it, the actual film back, would be the same size. And I imagine with a lot of the old parts, you're not necessarily needing more processing power for an older sensor. Like, these are essentially what I would suggest Ricoh doing is buying an older sensor for cheap. You could probably create the entire camera for not much more money than the GR is selling for now. And a lot of people are like, so $1,000. Well, first things first, the current GR is almost out of stock. And they've restocked it with the GR HDF or whatever the new filter is. And I want to say that's like 11 or 12, right? Like 1150, somewhere in there. So with that in mind, a $1,200-$1,300 full frame camera, I think, could reasonably be done. And I'm basing that on the fact that Nikon and Canon have full frame around, I think the Canon one, the RP now is retailing for around $950, or at least it was at some point. And the Nikon one, I want to say it's like $1,100-$1,200, but I constantly see it right around the $1,000 mark when it's on sale. So, I don't think the sensor is so expensive that would be cost prohibitive. So one, that. Two, if you take the exact lens from the GR original film cameras, they would fit. Now, the real difference between the film and like modern digital cameras is really just how sharp the lens is. So just so you're aware, film has about 12 megapixels worth of sharpness of detail that it will actually take. So, back in the day, if you're using old film lenses, you're only getting about 12 megapixels worth of sharpness. So yes, if you took that exact same lens, you would have to make it sharper. However, with modern technologies, you could pretty much take the exact same design and just get a better piece of glass. I don't think you need to change the design elements of the lens all that much. And I'm sure that they would update it somewhat, but essentially speaking, you're not having to add too many elements to make a completely new lens. So in terms of size, yeah, that's not really an issue. Two, what is the essence of GR? And I think it really comes down to two or three things. One, pocketability. It has to be pocketable. You have to be able to throw it in your pocket and be able to take it anywhere. Full frame doesn't change that at all. Image quality. You have to get good image quality and be able to pocket it. And that's the two biggest things. The third one I would say is price. Of the cameras with good image quality that are pocketable, it's the only cheap one. And in fact, as far as good image quality and pocketable, it's the only one, but it's also coupled with being a fairly inexpensive unit when compared to Fuji X100s, the Leica Qs, Sony's been out of the game for a while as it pertains to that, but like the old RX1s, RX1R, I'm not really going to get into the nomenclature of that. So the real issue, I think, is that people assume that because those cameras that are full frame, I understand the X100 is not, but both the Leica and the Sony RX1, they're fairly large cameras. And people say, oh, well, you know, the reason why it's larger is because of the sensor, it's because of the lens, it's because of the lens. It's not that necessarily that you would need a larger lens, it's just that the way that both Sony and Leica and for a lesser extent Fujifilm have designed those lenses, it's not the exact same type of lens that is on the Ricoh. Now, I like the Ricoh lens. I think it's very sharp. I like the way they do it. You cannot make a faster lens. Like, I think that's one of the things that people forget is how much faster those other lenses are compared to the Ricoh. So Ricoh can make a very sharp lens that is not a very fast lens. And that's one of the ways that you kind of combat size. Also, if you look at the way that the focusing mechanism works on the Ricoh lens, is one of the reasons why you're never going to get weather sealing, which is actually the number one thing that people ask for. I just don't think that you're going to be able, even on an APS-C unit, create a weather sealed lens that meets the cost requirements and also is going to be retractable for size and pocketability. So yes, I don't expect for the GR going forward to be a drastically different camera. I just think that full frame does make sense. I think it's a very marketable, nice to have. Now, one of the reasons why Pentax, Ricoh, whatever you want to call it, hasn't gone more into the full frame space is those lenses tend to be very new and kind of expensive if you're trying to be competitive. In fact, if you look at what Pentax did with their K3 they're using the modern Sony lens, which is also very apparent in a lot of the Fujifilm cameras. The the XT4 or 5 or one of those, the 26 megapixel, very fast readout sensors. That's what's on the Pentax K3. And the reason why is they're trying to sell that as a high-end item. So they have a little bit higher megapixel sensor, faster readout, a little bit better dynamic range. It's kind of considered a wonderkin in the APS-C space, but you're never going to see that on the GR because it doesn't make sense on the GR. Having a fast readout for a camera that really isn't designed to go, I don't think there's ever been a GR that has more than, I think, 4 frames a second. So that's never going to happen. People talk about there being faster autofocus. Again, I don't see Pentax Ricoh spending money on sensor autofocus. It's just not a thing. Like a majority of their money, R&D and whatnot goes into making a faster DSLR chip readout autofocus. The contrast detect from, a typical DSLR type of autofocus. So the idea that they're going to spend a lot of money trying to fit a GR, a mirrorless style on sensor autofocusing system, I just don't see it happening. I don't see them spending the money on that, especially when you have snap focus being the, quote unquote go-to. Also, when you have a 28 millimeter focal length on your camera, you're talking about a very wide, very deep focus. Like, you're not talking about like a narrow focus depth. So the idea that you're going to have a camera that is designed to have lightning autofocus, because quite honestly, whenever you're doing a subject that's further away, which typically you are in outdoor scenes, you're going to just kind of spray and pray, and it's kind of good enough. Like, it doesn't have to be tack sharp, tack on. That's why snap focus works so well, because again, you're working with a known commodity 28 millimeter focal length. So that doesn't make any sense to me. So I've addressed the weather sealing. Somebody said file sizes, and that doesn't make any sense to me either, because, I'm not suggesting a large megapixel full frame, modern, 45, 60 megapixel full frames. Not what I'm suggesting at all. I think that especially if you're looking for older full frame sensors, which I would suggest, 24 is typically the go-to. There's plenty of newer 24, but there's also plenty of very good older ones. I think like the D750, which I think is now the Z5 sensor is the same. Something along those lines in terms of quality, I think would be totally adequate. You're still not looking at 4K, which again, 4K, the biggest issue that 4K has on small bodied cameras is battery. Like 4K sucks that out. So like a slower reading, good dynamic range, full frame, 24 megapixel sensor from, a bygone era, I think that works perfectly well. I think it doesn't matter what the read speed on that is. People were also complaining that I talked about video at all. And like, this is the comment that maybe gave me the most ire, is somebody said that if I gave manual controls to the GR4 for video, that I would be making the camera bigger. And I feel like there's a failure to recognize that this manual control over video could be done with the existing controls that are already on the camera. It's just that they don't do anything in video because it goes into program mode. So the fact that there's no override, that there's no manual mode in video where you can just set the shutter speed, set the aperture, set the shutter speed, set the ISO, and have some manual control over video specs, would fix 90% of the problems and would be a complete software type of thing. It's all programming. They could fix the current GR's video issues with a firmware update 100% without adding any size to the thing. It's all programming. There's nothing in the specs that would prevent the camera from having manual controls. It's simply a software update issue. So the idea that you would purposefully keep a feature that would fix a glaring problem, I don't understand the logic in that. And saying that you're not particularly a video shooter yourself doesn't mean that there aren't people who would want video. I think that in terms of a camera for this size and portability, having a more robust video feature, especially with, honestly, the video output on the GR works really well. The dynamic range is really good in video. The video itself looks really good. It's just, like I said, for more professional applications, you'd need that manual control. So I feel like fixing that makes a lot of sense to me. And just because it doesn't necessarily mean anything to you, what it could mean is that more people would buy the GR. The GR's popularity means that they're going to spend more money on R&D or continue to produce and create improvements. So right now the GR3 is doing really well. So I would imagine that there is an incentive for Ricoh to put more money into R&D for the GR4, which is going to help everyone. In theory, if the GR4 doesn't sell well, the idea that the GR5 is going to sell well, there's going to get much R&D is a pipe dream. So you want the camera that's currently out that you like for whatever reason to do well, so that they keep updating, they keep putting money into the system, and it just doesn't become a dying system. In the same way that there's essentially no difference between a GR and a GR2. The GR didn't do well for whatever marketing reason, and the GR2 did fairly well. And they're like, oh, okay, we can actually update it with the GR3. The GR digital cameras also didn't do all that well, the 1.7 inch sensors that didn't do well. So again, I think that trying to be obtuse and be like, there's no video because I don't need video, is a very narrow-minded way of thinking. Somebody also said full frame has no purpose and nobody needs full frame. So I typically generally agree with that. I think full frame is generally overused. However, the things that full frame actually does well is somewhat perspective, which I feel like most people can't tell. But I feel like there is a little bit of a difference in terms of the look of full frame. You can tell if you really pay attention, but typically if you have good storytelling, I would agree that's not a big deal. The real issue is dynamic range and low light, which are things that are specifically applicable to the GR, because again, the GR for me is designed and generally thought of as a street camera. So if you're in the street, you don't really have control over lighting. I think studio photographers, that want full frame is silly to me because, again, like you don't need dynamic range because you control the lights in a studio environment. Whereas outside, I can't control the sun if it's a cloudy day, if it gets dark at night. If I'm just out with my GR, I don't necessarily have lighting with me to control it. And I really don't want to talk about the pop-up flash because pop-up flash is not a good source of lighting. I typically, if I'm actually doing something professional with my GR, I will take an external speed light for it. But generally speaking, I try to light with the environment, and having a little bit more pull and play with lighting in dynamic range in low light is something that, again, like you can't really control if you're doing street photography, you're doing outdoor photography. That's something that could actually really help the GR. It's one of the things that I think, of all the things people talk about, having good dynamic range would be way better for fixing lighting situations than a little dinky pop-up flash. Just, my opinion. Oh, the other funny one that somebody said was just buy a Leica M camera, which typically cost, 6 to 7, or I don't know. I don't even know how much a Leica costs because I just in my mind think, it's the price of a used car that I will never spend money on. So again, like I understand that there is a fair amount of like, haha, like I'm just trying to show off on a comment section about how much money I have. I understand that, in the street photography realm, that Leicas tend to do well with those types of people. That's fine. Go get your Leica. I also feel like, in the same comment sections that's complaining about the autofocus on the GR on a fairly slow 28 millimeter lens, that you're now going to manual focus on a full frame, typically faster Leica lens. So I don't really see that as being helpful. Again, I'm talking about a $1,200-$1,300 full frame camera as compared to, $6,000-$7,000 Leica. Somebody also said remove the LCD, which is funny. They only want the optical viewfinder built into the camera, which I feel like one would create size. Even if they were to, add those, and again, like I feel like the Ricoh GR aesthetic of how they make their money is by selling add-ons. Cost money to buy an extra battery, which you're definitely going to use. And if you have an extra battery, then you're going to need a external charger to charge one of them because, plugging into the camera with two batteries takes a while and it's just kind of cumbersome. Having the OVF to buy, having an extra lens thing to buy, and then, of course, all of the different street editions that are just basically coloring. Yeah, like that's definitely not going to be helpful. And a bigger battery. Again, with as many people who were complaining about the size that full frame would make, the idea that you're going to make a bigger battery is not really helpful. Battery is one of those things that, when you have a big battery, it typically creates a bigger size, which again goes into the X100, the bigger cameras. So I'm with people who want the small size of the camera, but I don't see any of that being helpful. And I do think that full frame does make a lot of sense, especially when you consider that APS-C sensors that are on the market to go as an increase or as to get better than what they currently have. You're getting into modern APS-C sensors. There hasn't been a lot of updates. It's the same thing with Micro Four Thirds. Like it's the same reason most of the Micro Four Thirds cameras still use the 20 megapixel sensor from 7-8 years ago. APS-C sensors, you have the 24 megapixel Sony that everyone has. That's also in the GR3. You have the 26 megapixel, and you have the new 40 megapixel. The 40 megapixel, I don't think anybody wants on the GR. The 26 megapixel, again, what makes the 26 megapixel camera good is the fast readout speeds, which again is useless on a GR. You also have like some of the BSI and the stack chip sensors for fast readout, which again is definitely for fast autofocus, for fast capture frames per second, which again GR is never going to use. What you could maybe do potentially if you're going to go that route is again buy the Nikon 20 megapixel sensor that was on the D500 and on whatever they're using now. I don't hate that option. I really don't, because of just the low light capabilities of that. But it's, again, it's a fast reading chip because the D500 was a sports camera. So I think you're going to be paying for features that you don't actually need on the GR to do that. I think in terms of buying something cheap, which is what Ricoh does, they repurpose old tech, and kind of put a couple of their technologies and spin on it, which in this case is, a small camera body. I think if you're going to do that, full frame makes way more sense going forward. I think it's not cost prohibitive. I think you could get the product out at a cheap amount, and I think that the number of people who actually do want full frame, they would exist, and I think that the GR3 would continually be sold along with the GR4 if that were the case. So I don't think you're going to lose anybody. And I think you would potentially gain a huge consumer base for an actual GR4 in full frame.